In July 1932, Germany went to the polls, and the outcome of this election sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The largest party was now the National Socialist German Workers' Party, otherwise known as the Nazis. Just 6 months later, one Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor, and in the following year, 1934, Hitler combined his title of Chancellor with President to become Führer. Germany was now a Nazi dictatorship. Now, we know what happened after this, but we're not here to talk about World War II. I want to go back to the beginning to find out how exactly the Nazis became so popular in the first place, and who was responsible for their rise.
The easy answer, of course, is Hitler.
Poverty breeds fascism, period.
And then we're going to speak to two experts who can hopefully tell us who or what was to blame for the rise of Nazis. Yep, that's right. I'm going to go talk to strangers about Nazis. Wish me luck. Who do you think was to blame for the rise of Nazism in Germany?
Oh, I mean, that's really complicated, isn't it? I mean, I suppose the economic conditions at the time, the Treaty of Versailles, the way that the First World War wasn't handled, at the end with the 14 points and all the rest of it.
Treaty of Versailles, isn't it? That put Germany under so much pressure and strain that it bred fascism. Everyone couldn't afford bread. So that's what happened.
Yeah, Hitler. I'll say he's to blame for it.
Obviously, he was quite a charismatic character, not a very good character, but yeah, he was able to convince people with his speeches and stuff.
Would Nazism have been so popular in Germany if not for Adolf Hitler?
Maybe not. He had a very, very specific character that actually helped him to become who he was. Any other person wouldn't have gone that far.
If he wasn't there, someone else would have stepped into the role.
I do, but I think it would have been a very different political party. I think the evidence of that is what happened to it between, say, it was at 24 and 26 when he was imprisoned and the party was still in existence, but just had a very different character about it.
I think he selected the right bad folks, like with Goering and a whole bunch of others.
Also, many people didn't say anything against it, and so it basically helped Hitler to even get more and more power.
The fear that he was able to create, and ultimately people, I guess, wanted something to focus on and wanted something to be fearful of.
So that's really interesting. I assumed everyone would just say Hitler straight away, but we've actually had a real variety of answers, and the public really know their stuff. I'm going to take these answers to the experts and see what they can tell us. Joining me today are Professor Matthew Feldman and Professor Nadine Rossol, both experts on 20th century Europe and the rise of fascism. It's time to find out who was to blame for the Nazis. Right, hi guys, thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to be delving into who was to blame for the rise of Nazism in Germany. But before we look at the public's responses, I wanted to ask you, what are you expecting to hear? How much do you think the public knows about the rise of Nazism?
I think the British public knows quite a bit about the rise of the Nazis because it's well covered in schools, it's very well covered in documentaries on telly and so on. And of course, we also know there's quite a thriving book market on anything to do with Nazi Germany, Hitler in particular.
And let's not forget, this is one of the best documented periods in human history. So it's a familiar area, but I think that sometimes the message can become a little bit simplistic. We think of Nazism as the world's greatest evil, and there's a lot of good reason for it. But that then leads a lot of people to think Nazism was nihilistic, that it was simply just people getting up, looking in the mirror and saying, I'm going to try to be as bad as I can today. Unfortunately, the challenge of Nazism and the rise of the NSDAP really forces us to re-examine some of those assumptions.
By classifying the Nazis as evil, that doesn't help our understanding. That also doesn't help our understanding how a party like this can grow, what was interesting about them to the ordinary German. Perhaps we can do a little bit of myth busting later on.
Great, should we dive in then? Right, I'm going straight in with a big question here. Who do you think was to blame for the rise of Nazism in Germany?
Oh, I mean, that's really complicated, isn't it? I mean, the Treaty of Versailles, you know, many things leading up to it, you know, both the First and Second World War. But of course, the way that the First World War wasn't handled, you know, at the end with the 14 points and all the rest of it.
The Treaty of Versailles, isn't it? That put Germany under so much pressure and strain that it bred what's the word? Fascism. Everyone couldn't afford bread, so that's what happened.
Yeah, I would say, but the First World War didn't exactly help either. The Treaty of Versailles was very harsh on Germany as well after the war. I think the Allies were a bit rough with them, and they were a bit too harsh, especially the French and the British.
The Treaty of Versailles was a peace agreement between Germany and the Allied powers, namely France, Britain and the United States, which ended World War I. Signed in June 1919, the treaty outlined the terms for peace by punishing Germany. It had them pay reparations, give up territory and take full responsibility for starting the war. The Treaty of Versailles was a really popular answer. And I think before we dive into how much it was to blame, Nadine, would you like to just outline very briefly what the Treaty of Versailles was, please?
It's a treaty that creates massive resentment across the entire German population because Germany expected a much more lenient peace treaty. Now, this is not to say that this was a reasonable expectation, but this was what people as well as politicians thought. It was a harsh treaty, it was humiliating as well, but it's not completely out of line with other types of these sort of peace treaties. It includes a lot of territorial losses, massive reparation payments, a war guilt clause that sort of suggests Germany is responsible for the outbreak of the First World War. And you have to remember, Germany believed it was fighting a defensive war. So there are many things in the treaty that created very difficult starting point for this new democratic republic.
I'm really glad you brought up the war guilt clause because I think there's this understanding that the Treaty of Versailles had terrible reparations. And I feel like that's what you're taught at school, that's what people know. But Matthew, how far is this war guilt clause really almost the worst thing for Germany?
So in terms of a kind of a sense of humiliation, as Nadine said, arguably the biggest. Germany's lost an eighth of its population, an eighth of its territory. Its army is busted down to 100,000 people. It loses colonies. Those are serious things. So in that sense, I think the war guilt clause is something that radicals, particularly on the right, are able to continue to point to and say, look, the First World War was basically a tie. How come we're having to do this? The person who's arguably most angry about this is someone who had previously been left of center. And that person was Adolf Hitler. Most people who had served in World War I, and as Nadine very rightly said, this was a shock of immense proportions. Hitler absolutely blew his stack and at that point finds himself 4 months later in a new political party which he soon takes over.
There is an argument to say that it had that early impact on Hitler, who arguably is very central to the rise of Nazism.
I wouldn't say it gives rise to the Nazi party, but it gives the National Conservative side weapons that they constantly use to attack the Republic. You can always go back to it and you can always say, and what about Versailles? And what about the lost war? And are we not a much poorer country now? And we're much smaller as well, and that's humiliating for our sort of, national sense of Germanness and all these sort of things. And you can always blame the new Republican government.
Can I show you a few more of the clips?
Sure.
The British and particularly the French wanted their pound of flesh from Germany at the end of the First World War. Woodrow Wilson, again, if I get my facts right, was sort of more, he wanted a better outcome, a more fair, just, long-lasting peace. But at the end of the day, for whatever reasons, the German and the British sort of got their way.
There was one of the elections, I can't remember. I know 33 they came to power, but 28 they had the election or whatever it was. And they only got something around 3% of the vote or something, whereas 33 they got like over 30% or whatever it was. So I think once the economic hardships kicked in, it really pushed, it was a catalyst for it really,
Yeah, just to fact check that there, is he bang on with
2.8%, they were lower than the monster raving loony party in this country a few years ago. So that's absolutely true that they basically get tenfold or more than tenfold votes in the 4 years afterwards.
What is perhaps a little bit more blurry is the treatment of Germany by the Allies, and there's a suggestion that the Allies are completely agreed upon how they're going to treat Germany after the war. They're not, right? The French want to make sure Germany is as weak as possible, you know, from the French point of view, quite rightly, because they're going to say, look, they always start wars, right? And they're our direct neighbors. The British are much more on a sort of moderate side, are a bit more interested in a more stable, balanced sort of Europe, so are the Americans. So there isn't a sort of Germany against all the Allies.
Shall we see what else the public had to say?
When you put people under extreme pressure like they did, and people not being able to afford bread and food, then there's going to be trouble.
You could say the economic collapse in 1928.
The Wall Street crash, you had all the economic confusion at the time.
But there's a lot of talk about the economic situation. We're talking about the Great Depression here, aren't we?
Well, I'm not sure we do. I think that they're lumping in the 1923 hyperinflation and the Great Depression, and I would suggest that those are separate things.
From the early 1920s, Germany faced a crisis. Hyperinflation caused prices to rise so quickly that money became almost worthless. Then, in 1929, the Wall Street crash in the US triggered the Great Depression, leaving people all over the world struggling for jobs and money.
Let's remember, during the hyperinflation, anybody that has savings, it's gone overnight. It is cheaper to burn money than it is to burn wood in winter. So this is like meltdown of society.
Yeah. So which one holds more blame when it comes to the rise of the Nazis, the Treaty of Versailles or the Great Depression?
I'm for the Great Depression.
Great. One vote for the Great Depression?
I would do that with a caveat, which
Okay.
is that it's not just the Great Depression itself. The Nazis, from 1925 on, think of it as a roulette table. They put all of their chips on 18 black, and it comes in 1929. Theoretically, it should have been the KPD, the communists, who benefit the most from a sort of economic meltdown.
Yeah.
But it's actually the Nazis, and that's because their ground game was really sophisticated.
I don't quite like counterfactual sort of history, you know, what happened if this hadn't happened and so on. But if we for a moment think, what if there hadn't been an economic downturn? Would the Nazis have risen to power that quickly or at all? I think probably not. I think the Republic would have survived certainly longer. Would it have survived forever and so on and become a very stable democracy? Who knows? So I think the economic depression accelerated a movement that was there already. The rise of the Nazi Party isn't that all the desperate poor people vote for the Nazis. Some of them did, but it's also that shaken up lower middle class people voted for the Nazis. So it's a sort of sense of we are maybe not quite poor yet, but we're afraid we will be in the future if this continues.
Right, so his name has come up a little bit already, and I don't think we can avoid it anymore. Let's have a look at some more clips, shall we? Who or what was responsible for the rise of Nazism in Germany?
I think it was Hitler and how he was good with propaganda, right? A little bit like you see these days as well. Kind of the populist themes really seemed to work out in that time in the 30s.
Yeah, Hitler. I'll say he's to blame for it.
Obviously, he was quite a charismatic character. Not a very good character, but yeah.
Manipulation got him to the top where like he tries to convince people saying, oh, he's this good guy, this and that, and then realistically, he's not.
He was able to convince people with his speeches and stuff.
That like after the First World War, everyone was so put down and like everything just collapsed. Maybe the people just wished like one person who could tell them what to do.
He had a very, very specific character that actually helped him to become who he was. And I think that any other person maybe wouldn't have gone that far. So I would say that without him existing or without him being, the Nazis wouldn't have been that popular.
Okay, let's pause it there for a second then. One question I have is there's this really popular idea that Hitler was this charismatic leader and this great speaker. Like, how true is that?
I personally think that is their USP, the Nazis' USP. Remember, this is a period just before the conquest of film and radio. The spoken word in political terms is still the most important thing. In fact, right through the middle 20s, most German states ban Hitler from speaking. It's one of the reasons the Nazis can't take off until those speaking bans are removed in 1928.
Yeah.
He presented himself as a sort of savior figure, a sort of shaman after his release from prison in 1924. And a lot of people were looking for that in Germany, especially during conditions of economic crisis.
Nadine, do you agree? Was he this really charismatic leader?
Partly. I think we might have to be careful of overstressing the charismatic element. What the Nazis or the Nazi Party certainly did very well is they established Hitler as their brand, right? Yeah. There's a reason why it occasionally on ballot papers is called the Hitler movement. Hitler is above party politics, even in his own party, and that remains quite steady throughout the 1930s. And even when the war goes badly, there is an assumption of, oh, his generals are messing up the war. Surely he doesn't know about this.
And I mean, it did have an incredibly strong brand. But I guess what I'm wondering is, how far is our understanding of Hitler as this great speech maker and charismatic leader or strong leader based on Nazi propaganda that is out there? Because there was a lot of it. So has some of that even trickled down into our understanding of him?
A lot of what we think Nazism looked like is based on visual images from the time. So it's often based on films. It's some of them created by Leni Riefenstahl, probably the most well-known ones. It's based on photographs of marches and so on. Quite a bit of that visual material is Nazi propaganda and is staged. These films weren't just somebody showing up with a camera and filming what was happening. The same goes for some of the photographs we often refer to when we look at sort of Nazi success and we say, oh, look, this is the victory parade after, Hitler is appointed chancellor. Yes, there is a victory parade, but the weather was terrible, it was dark, so they restaged this at a time when the weather was better and they could take better photographs. Nevertheless, these type of photographs of this restaged victory parade are the ones we often have in school books. So I do think we have to be careful of, particularly our sense of everything went perfectly. That is very often based on imagery the Nazis have created for us.
So did the Nazi Party exist before Hitler? Like, when did Hitler come onto the scene exactly?
So I'm actually going to say yes and no, which is to say there was a German Workers' Party founded by these two guys, Karl Herrer and Anton Drexler. And in fact, it's basically a drinking club in Munich, okay? Hitler rocks up in September of 1919 and all of a sudden blows them away with his oratory. They're trying to bring together the socialists and the nationalists. And Hitler in 1921, when he basically forces his way into the leadership, gets rid of these other guys, says, I've got an idea. We're going to call it the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler changes the name and changes its direction from basically a bunch of idiots sitting around a pub talking about how they're going to change the world to actually starting to do it under Hitler.
Would Nazism have become as popular and become what it was without Hitler?
All these sort of fascist ideologies need a charismatic leader, and he was that.
Well, no, I guess, I mean, there's always somebody that sparks up, but Hitler did seem to be sort of that kind of germ which everybody mobilized around. Quite possibly there would have been another person who'd have taken advantage of the situation, but you just don't know, do you?
So he couldn't join another party and still taken with him his psycho beliefs.
If he wasn't there, someone else would have stepped into the role.
I do, but I think it would have been a very different political party. I think the evidence of that is what happened to it between, say, was it 24 and 26 when he was imprisoned and the party was still in existence, but just had a very different character about it and maybe tried to sort of legitimize or had the potential to legitimize itself a little more than it subsequently went on to the immediate release.
In 1923, there was a dramatic attempt to seize control of the Bavarian government, known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler and his followers stormed a Munich beer hall, hoping to ignite a national revolution. However, the coup collapsed within hours. 16 Nazis were killed, Hitler was arrested, and it looked as though his political career was over.
He gets a sympathetic judge. Let's give him a slap on the wrist. He gets 9 months. He's out the same year that he goes in. And he gets really cushy conditions, and he dictates the first chapter of Mein Kampf. It is the pivotal moment in the rise of the Nazis.
While it's a failed coup, it gives Hitler, particularly the subsequent court trial, massive publicity. beyond Munich and Bavaria. Everyone else could have said, look guys, you tried and you failed actually quite miserably. That's it. And so they turned something that is actually would have finished other political parties into something that helps them to kickstart later
impressive, really. So there were a few other names that came up, and I'm interested to see what you guys think.
I think he selected the right bad folks, like with Göring and a whole bunch of others. Yeah, all looking for power, I guess.
You think sort of Fatty Göring would have been far more sort of congenial, and maybe he'd have made a pact much easier with some other countries, and in that way Germany would have achieved its aims.
Okay. Why did you have that reaction, Matthew?
He doesn't actually have a major role. I mean, he sort of deputizes as the head of the SA in the 1920s. Doesn't really have a major role until 1932, presiding over Parliament. So he's a comparatively minor figure to, let's say, some of the other leading Nazis at that time.
Slightly strange choice that the British public knows about this particular one.
Why do you think they do know about Göring?
I have an easy answer for that. He was the main guy in the Nuremberg trials. Everybody sees it. He is the last surviving major Nazi leader.
There's also a sense of he's the one you can make most fun of. If you know, he's the sort of the fat bloke who, you know, is into sort of
heroin,
hunting. Well, that too, but also sort of hunting. So you know, maybe there's sort of something that appeals particularly to a British audience to remember that sort of name.
Let's see what other names people mentioned.
Is there anyone else around Hitler that you think could be to blame? Like it was a
well, Goebbels was very into it, wasn't he? Let's face it. And the propaganda machine. I think any one of those top officials, whatever they were, generals, could have, you know, carried on that battle quite easily.
No, he was a follower, you know, made in Germany. But remember, he's kind of nowhere until 1926 when Hitler, he's one of these socialists in the north. Hitler's not going for that, invites him down to the Brown House in Munich, which is their kind of headquarters. And Hitler spends a couple of hours with him, and Goebbels is licking his boots at the end of that. Hitler gives him the sort of leadership of Berlin in 1926. He doesn't actually become the propaganda chief until April 1930.
So you don't think Goebbels could have replaced Hitler as leader of the Nazi Party, but arguably he was incredibly influential, especially as part of the propaganda machine, right?
He is important. He becomes even more important of being this propaganda machine again when the Nazis come into power. But he's not a front figure. It's difficult to put Goebbels in front of an audience and think he will now persuade the masses.
He's the opposite of the Aryan that they're talking about.
But he's a good writer and he likes a fight.
Wow, so Goebbels loves a challenge.
Yes, and part of it is because he understands how publicity is created. Whether you win or lose, the rest of the political elite, newspapers and so on are going to write about you. So therefore you get much more publicity than you actually maybe have in terms of election results, or maybe you even have in terms of membership, but everyone else talks about you. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the strategy.
Well, yeah, Goebbels is obviously very important, but perhaps wouldn't have been a leader himself. He couldn't have replaced Hitler. But are there any other names or Nazi politicians who arguably do have some blame as to the rise of the Nazis?
For me, I would say there's Goebbels' mentor. His name is Gregor Strasser. He's the head of the sort of northern faction. People are emphasizing socialism. He is alongside Hitler in the putsch, but is released from prison because he's elected to the local Bavarian parliament, gives the Nazis' first speech. He is the guy who says, Hitler, you're not a drummer anymore. You're not John the Baptist. You're the savior. They know that the spoken word is what's working for them, and Strasser was the man behind all of that until he sort of leaves. He's unhappy with Hitler by 1932. He ends up being killed in the Night of Long Knives, but really his legacy lives on in some ways through his protege, Joseph Goebbels.
So Strasser is arguably, he's the one that starts this sort of branding and this myth and this cult around Hitler.
There were some dynamics there beforehand, but he's the one that streamlines it. But Strasser is the guy that really changes the dynamics of Nazism from the shooting to the voting.
Again, coming back to propaganda, I think we think often about Nazi posters, for example, with, you know, sort of a fist destroying other parties or something along those lines. That's a sort of big city type of propaganda. But particularly in rural areas, in small towns, these posters don't work. It's the people you send to the local pub who sort of gives a speech who might convince the people who come to this, right? So they sort of infiltrate the countryside and small towns much earlier than they do big cities. Yeah. And even though it doesn't immediately turn into sort of massive successes, that's their stronghold and they build from that.
It's clear that propaganda was incredibly important to the rise of the Nazis, but was this kind of propaganda unique to the Nazi Party at the time?
It depends on what we think about propaganda. And in no small measure, thanks to Joseph Goebbels, we talk about what's black propaganda, lies, telling you that the sky is blue when it's not, that kind of stuff. What they're doing is they're shaving off the bad bits and they're giving you the good bits. Nazism's going to come in, it's going to do law and order, it's going to get rid of all the dirty stuff that you don't like, and we're going to do it in a way that you feel comfortable with. Yeah. So they're able to kind of switch it up in a really, really nuanced way that is something that really starts to kind of get people paying attention in the early 1930s.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just crazy. Like, Nadine, this is a party that have their own flag, their own logo, almost, if you can call the swastika that. They have their own gestures and greetings. Like, that today would ring so many alarm bells.
Well, one thing we have to remember that, of course, political symbolism that belongs to certain political directions is not something that the Nazis invent, right? The communists have their own flags, the Republicans have their own flag, have their own greetings, have their own parades, have their own uniforms and all the rest. That is not unique to the Nazis. But they are quite good in creating unrest, right? Nazi membership at this particular point is very young in terms of age. So they're appealing to a group who says, right, let's get out there and beat up some communists. That's fun. And that's part of the excitement, if you want to call it like this, that they're creating.
I guess the question is, are there any other Nazi leaders that hold more blame and more responsibility for the rise of Nazism than Hitler?
No, not to me. Okay. There are some close seconds. I think Strasser, and the other person that hasn't come up yet is Ernst Röhm. He really oversees the growth of the Nazis' hammer, which is the stormtroopers.
Now, one thing, of course, to remember is both of the close second we mentioned here are not important anymore and in fact killed by the summer of 1934. Hitler eventually becomes quite good in also dealing with internal competition. And by that time, he deals with any sort of one who's internally questioning his authority or his sort of line of thinking.
Well, we've talked an awful lot about the politicians and the politics, but I'm interested to see what was sort of, how much responsibility was held maybe within the German people and the German population more widely. So are you ready to hear more of the answers? Do you think that without the economic struggles that Germany were feeling, like would Nazism have been as popular as it got?
Well, no, it wouldn't have been as popular, but of course it was popular. I mean, he didn't just seize power; he was sort of almost legitimately obtained power, and you can see the reasons why he legitimately obtained power. Because for the ordinary German person, it seemed like the best thing since sliced bread. I'd have probably voted for him myself.
I do think it's worth noting, and not everyone really knows this or recognises this, that obviously the Nazi Party didn't just seize power, as he said. They were voted in within a democracy.
They were appointed. So it was within the democratic bounds. It's something called Article 48. This basically allows you to rule by decree. It is a backroom deal forged with the most popular party at that time, which is getting basically a third of the votes or more in 1932. It would be a natural thing in a democracy. Of course, rub is, these guys are very overt and saying, we'll come to power legally, and then we're going to put democracy to bed forever.
Yeah. You could argue a revolution is what they do when they are in power, but it wasn't a revolution to get into power. It was based on the Weimar Constitution, and it was the party that had the majority of the vote.
And let's not forget, Hitler is the gambler. He's offered the vice chancellorship in 1932. He's offered a range of different positions, and he holds out. And Hitler says, we are going to hold our nerve. I'm taking the chancellorship or nothing. And that turns out to be correct. It's a minority coalition government for the Nazis. They have 3 seats, but they have the most important seats. And by the summer of 1933, it is a one-party state.
And they are in a government with people, with the national conservative elites who dramatically overestimate their influence and underestimate the Nazis and underestimate the power the Nazis want to get and the radical speed by which they want to change this state. And by the summer of 1933, all other parties are banned. The Nazi Party is the only one that's still allowed, and all political enemies have been, eradicated in many ways. The fact that they have a great majority of the German vote makes it really difficult to keeping them out of power.
I think it's so interesting what was happening in Germany at the time with the everyday German person. So I've got a few more clips to show you, if that's all right.
Poverty breeds fascism. Period.
Poverty feeds fascism.
Yes, period. The only reason we have fascism now is because of the 2008 financial crisis. So.
Wow. Okay, no, tell me more about that in the context of...
Well, because as people get poorer, they look for someone to blame. And the people in charge will always say it's the other person's fault. And so they other people, like homosexuals or trans people now, or people of different races, or that's why.
Looking for scapegoats.
Exactly.
He was just a mouthpiece, right? But it was obviously people had those sentiments to start with. If people with small minds always, blame a minority or blame someone, who they feel is being treated better than themselves.
He says there, poverty fuels fascism. How far is that true in the context of 1920s and 1930s Germany?
Poverty fuels extremism, I would argue.
Left and right, you mean?
Left and right, exactly. Left and right. The Nazis appealed across the German society, even to those who weren't poor. And therefore this doesn't quite, this sort of poverty creates Nazism or fascism.
False. Yeah. Again, they have a representative sample of German society as a whole. And it's true that fascism is a creature of crisis. It's like lifting up the rock and letting them crawl out. But this idea that people are voting essentially for their material well-being. I'm poor, I'm going to vote for these guys. I think it completely misses the thrust, the core of Nazism, which is hope. It's belief. What is the Third Reich anyway? Step right back. The First Reich lasts 1,000 years. The Second Reich is 1871 to 1918. The Third Kingdom is meant to last 1,000 years. This is utopian. These guys are not nihilists. And in fact, I think it's worse than that, because once you say we can achieve this great utopia, but we're not going to be stopped by anything. There is nothing stopping you. So if you pin the blame, and we haven't really talked about this, squarely on Jews, and say once we get rid of them, we are going to have a utopia. That projection of a new reality, even a new utopia, that's the scary bit to me.
Yeah, we disagree on Nazism as a new religion. However, we don't disagree on the bit about hope. So it's not just poverty, because some of the people here talk about scapegoating. That's important too, right? So you find all sorts of enemies and people to blame. For the Nazis, it's the Jewish population, but of course not only the Jewish populations. There are political opponents on the left. It's all sorts of people. But that doesn't work. You don't get people to vote for you if you do a sort of purely negative campaign. As Matthew said, you also need to give people something to hope for, something positive. Don't just tell me whose fault it is. What are you going to do so that I think you're going to create a better Third Reich, a better future for me? Clear that not everyone is meant to be part of this, but for the ordinary German voter, they are, and therefore they have hope and belief in this.
They were promising this fantastic future community, this utopian sort of community. But within that, inherently, there's a scapegoating, there's an othering. We need to push a load of people out.
Not everyone's part of that.
Not everyone is welcome in this big united community. Let's see what the public have to say.
People always talk about, yes, he was vegetarian, yes, he was a great leader. But it was just the othering of other people. And the fear that he was able to create, and ultimately people, I guess, wanted something to focus on and wanted something to be fearful of.
I think the need to blame another in order to right the ills that a society was feeling was so prevalent and predominant, and the Jews were just a very obvious target throughout European history over the 19th and 20th century, that they just made a very easy target.
His mindset was to kill off all the Jews. And obviously, I don't know why, but I'd feel like everyone should live equally and no one should be discriminated by race, religion, wherever. And I think it's just wrong what he done.
So yes, we can't have a conversation about the rise of Nazism without talking about anti-Semitism. and the scapegoating.
Much misunderstood, actually. Much misunderstood.
How so?
They were against the left, they were against people with disabilities, but the fuel it runs on, the thing at the core, is a vision of a world without Jews. Because fascism is nothing other than a belief in sameness and homogeny. It is a war on difference.
And it's a race, in the end, it's a racist dictatorship, right?
Absolutely.
So it doesn't, and that's not debatable, right? While other things, if you were a very committed communist, but you tried very hard and showed to the Nazis you're now believing in their cause, maybe you're in. Not if you're Jewish. Okay, there's no way how you can try as hard as you want, you can pretend to be the best National Socialist ever. You're not part of this community because it's based on race.
In 1925, if you were Jewish, arguably the best place in the world to live would have been Germany. Yeah. Maybe Britain, maybe the United States. It is the best place to live in terms of your protections and your safety. Within 10 years, of course, their rights are stripped away through the Nuremberg laws, and then in the coming years, 6 million are exterminated. Let's also remember, and I completely agree with Nadine, there's a racial dictatorship, but it's also more than that. Who is the first group systematically killed by the Nazis through a decree on the 18th of August 1939? Disabled children under the age of 3, who are considered dysgenic, a burden on society. Again, I come back to the point about sameness. They represented difference. So did gay people, so did Roma and Sinti people. Again, the core is a racist vision of a world without Jews. But they are absolutely going to war on difference.
Outside of the Nazi Party, how much was anti-Semitism within sort of everyday normal German people to blame?
When the Nazis come to power, they're not the only anti-Semitic group, okay? So there are other anti-Semitic groups in German society. They are the more successful ones, obviously. I would argue anti-Semitism is not the key to their success. And it's always, of course, much easier in hindsight to sort of say, but isn't this logical? This. No, it's not. It wasn't logical for the people at the time.
Yeah. Thanks, Nadine. I know it's tough to summarise how a whole nation of people were feeling. And with that in mind, I just have one final clip to show you.
Maybe also because of the wish for someone, who like kind of gives them a direction or orientation. Also, many people didn't say anything against it, even though they maybe they knew that it was wrong. But they didn't say anything, most of them. And so it basically helped Hitler to just even get more and more power. Yeah, because like they use a lot of violence to spread fear, and that's why a lot of people probably just didn't they were afraid to speak up.
What do you think about this idea of we can blame apathy, the apathy of the German people for the rise of the Nazis?
Voting figures are in the sort of 70s or so, 70% or so for the entire Weimar Republic. So people were certainly interested in sort of, casting their vote, in expressing their political view. So I don't think apathy is what you'd call that. I do think when the Nazis come to power after 1933, there's a very deliberate strategy by the Nazis to turn people away from politics, and quite a successful one, and quite rightly, why would you not in a dictatorship say, I'm just mainly going to focus on myself and my personal circumstances? So there's a sort of deliberate creation of political apathy when it comes to the Nazis being in power.
Matthew, would you describe this as fear?
I can see the fear in the 1930s, certainly once you see the Nazi Party. I mean, we're talking about 240 concentration camps in and around Berlin in the first months after Hitler comes to power. That's the fear. I would use two different adjectives here: exhaustion and belief. People were like, I'm done with this. I'm done with this experiment. Who wants 33 political parties and all this choice? What Hitler was offering was a removal of that. And boy, that was attractive after 3 years of like massive unemployment and, serious crises. No, people were exhausted. And I think that they wanted to believe that they were at the bottom and things were only going to get better. And I would suggest in 1933, for most Germans, things did get better. Yeah. The problem was it was a Faustian bargain which was we're going to eliminate Jews and anything else that was considered impure. And of course, 1943 to 45 is reaping the whirlwind of that. And of course, life gets far worse.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the difference between the Nazi Party trying to gain its power versus the Nazi Party then retaining its power. Very, very different.
When you read what people who lived through the 1920s and the 1930s and the Nazi period, when they write about what was the sort of most prosperous time period in your life, and it wasn't particularly, but even those particular people who are way left-minded and so on, they say 1933 until 1936, right? They, you know, because stuff stabilizes, you know, you benefit from this dictatorship if you are, you know, if you're not excluded from it.
Tick the right boxes.
Well, if you make a deal with the devil, they're going to give you shiny stuff up front, but boy, the cost at the end is really going to, you know, as it did in Nazi Germany, cost you your soul.
Right, so we're just taking a quick break so we can mull over the discussion so far. And what strikes me from talking to Nadine and Matthew is that clearly so much was happening after World War I, socially, politically, economically, but it all keeps coming back to Hitler. That is from how he shaped the Nazi Party early on, all the way to how this cult was built around him later. However, time for me to put the big question to the experts and find out once and for all who was to blame for the Nazis. So let's go find out. Right, guys, we've heard from the public and we've had this great discussion today about all the different parts, moving parts of the rise of the Nazis. But this is the big question. In your professional opinion, who was to blame for the rise of Nazism in Germany?
I would give you three very simple, everybody's to blame kind of thing. One, seduce conservatives. Again, we heard it from von Papen saying, we've got them exactly where we want them in 1932, 1933. How wrong they very much were. Also, liberal hypocrisy. The idea of basically giving a little bit more of a benefit of the doubt to the Nazis than they did to the communists. Third, I do think that the left, and in particular the communists, overplayed their hands, thinking that they could fight it out in the street, but not really having a strategy for what they're going to do. After all, Hitler was pretty explicit in what he wanted to do in Mein Kampf, which was on shelves by 1925 and 1926.
If I had to push you for one of those answers, though,
yes, I would suggest it's seduce conservatives.
okay, they underestimated him, I guess.
Everybody
Yes,
did.
They underestimated him. They underestimated the Nazis. Therefore, I agree with Matthew. National conservatives, to some extent, also bourgeois elites, who sort of make him and the Nazi Party electable for certain circles. The communists, yes, might have overplayed their hand, but liberals and social democrats were actually, you know, fighting against the Nazis for quite a long time. And I always find it quite tricky to sort of blame the enemies of the Nazis for the rise of the Nazis.
That's a fair comment.
We can't just blame the elites. We also need to blame those people who voted and in one way or another supported the Nazi movement. The way how he was appointed was down to individual choices by individual personalities that made these choices for certain reasons. The reason why they were even in a position to think about this is because they were attracted by the great support of the German population he had, and therefore the party and Hitler became something you had to actually deal with.
You know, blame can be spread around, but let's place it first and foremost where it belongs. The Nazis, Hitler, his henchmen, the people that voted for them, the members. Lots of people can say we could have done things differently, but let's not remove all agency from German people or any other people that support fascism. You want to know who's to blame first and foremost, most directly? The people that supported Nazism, the people that gave them money, the people that wanted them in power.
And therefore the ones who are to blame are the Nazis and those in the elites, as well as in the population of the German people, supported them to come to power.
Days after Hitler comes to power, one of the great anti-Nazi journalists named Joseph Roth, covering the 1924 trial, he says, the barbarians have taken over. Hell reigns. How right he was.
So thank you so much, guys. This has been, it's a very big subject, a complicated subject, but I feel like we've really unpacked it today. And I think we're all closer to understanding who or what was to blame for the rise of the Nazis. So thanks very much. So there we go. We've heard from the public and we've even heard from the experts, but I want to know what you think. Do you agree? Let us know in the comments below.